The stagnant woman reeked as she yawned at the ceiling. Her skin and the layers of flesh below were bruised rubber. The features of her face were formed from some ungodly plastic, melted and distorted into something which echoed a human figure but could not define it. She had become this sort of object that was, in ways, both beautiful and ugly. A horrible work of nature, an aborted miracle, a moldering bag of disease that had, at one time, hoped, dreamed, struggled, and suffered. Flies and other insects had eaten away her jawline, and now moved freely into and out of her rotted neck and mandibles. Something pulsed below the lids where her eyes had been, and here life was reborn. The stagnant woman was human no longer, now only a host to the ecosystem of the dead. Joey followed Rickman as he stepped over the decrepit body. Her corpse was fresh compared to those they had seen in recent months, and yet neither traveler paid much attention to the woman. They had only a grimace to offer her. No sympathy remained. That emotion had been lost to the crumbling pages of history now for quite a while. Joey tightened his iron grip on the handkerchief he had secured tightly against his mouth. The stench of death, it would seem, is not the type of thing to which one can grow accustomed, no matter how prevalent it may be in your day-to-day routine. For Joey and Rickman, it was a long-standing constant. They could learn to cope, but never to adjust. God damn the rotting dead. Joey had lost count of the hours and of the days he and Rickman had been scouring this particular town. It was just another cluster of forgotten colonization, unremarkable from the place before it, or the one that he knew would come after it, or the one 3 months down the line. The Spanish name wasn't much help to him either. Over the past several months, one street blurred into the next. One name could mean anything. One corpse began to look like another, and, indeed, to look like every other. Districts, borderlines, whatever. None of it had meaning anymore, and perhaps it never had. It was Rickman who found Joey, about 14 months ago, give or take. He spotted the young man walking along a stretch of highway with his dog Trip, somewhere between Antigonish and Sherbrooke. Back in the early days, the pair were cautiously ambitious. They scoured the suburbs and they searched the cities, holding on to the hope that, at any moment, they might find another survivor. And it was the fumes that drove them until the bitter end, when those last few remnants of optimism withered away and died. The sun would set, with each passing day wanting the slightest suggestion their efforts might be meaningful. And with each passing day, the sun would rise again. Only a piece of light had turned to dark and did not return. They saw the sick at first, not much livelier than the dead, scattered among the hollow towns and cities, scattered like living bread for the gulls. The first few dozen that they passed, they would try to help. Rickman consoled them while Joey fed them. They would often take turns staying awake if the victim was a fighter. It was after number 28, a young girl, no older than 14, that they just stopped trying. They would avert their eyes and become deaf to the moans and pleas of the suffering who could not be helped. Soon enough, they were all dead anyway. And finally, miles and months later, Joey and Rickman found that they were just going through the motions. They were just keeping themselves alive and searching in vain. But they were searching. Always searching. Rickman opened the thick wooden door at the end of the long hallway, and they stepped inside to see another pile of people hoarded into a mass grave. Dozens, if not hundreds of bodies were piled on top of one another like foul, wet blankets. Not one of them in evidence had ever matured to adulthood. The room would have served as a gymnasium in earlier days, with basketball nets hanging at either end as a reminder of more innocent times. Pictures of the students, whose very bones now lay exposed before the travelers, were presented on the gray brick walls, hung carefully with sticky tack. All of their activities, all of their achievements, all recorded and displayed with pride. Joey felt like an archaeologist uncovering a 1,000-year-old tomb, but really, it had only been little more than a year since the last sock hop came to a close, and time was a vanishing concept. Although the stench was overpowering in this room, even more so than the last, Rickman removed the handkerchief from his face and dropped his weary heap onto a wall-side bench. Slouching, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled from it a cigar and a fancy metal lighter. Joey, a young man at the age of 19, was concerned by the desperate look on Rickman's face. Rickman lit his cigar and spit onto the floor beside him.
I thought you were saving that as your victory cigar, Rick.
Joey sounded pathetic, like a whining child, and he knew it. A flush of self-consciousness coursed through him, giving way to anxiety. All he wanted to do was leave this awful room and get back to the truck, but he knew that Rickman wouldn't be moving for a while. He was getting pale, and seemed to be coming down with the bad flu, worse this time than the last.
This is it, kid. This is the school where my little girl was. Closest I'm getting to victory. Jesus, kid.
Come on, why don't we go back to the truck and have water?
I'm not going anywhere.
Rickman passed the keys over to Joey and took in some of his cigar, his lips barely touching the tobacco leaf.
I'm dying now. That all right with you?
Joey's stomach crept into his throat. He felt like he could scream, and he had all of the rage, fear, and panic that he needed to do it with. But he knew that if he let himself scream, he would cry at the end. Joey could remember the last time he cried, and didn't ever think he could do it again, least of all in front of his old friend. If Rickman died, Joey would be alone, just one small step from non-existence. A man can only take so much.
You're not.
I am, kid. Now listen.
Rickman leaned back against the wall and seemed to be, at least for the moment, feeling a bit more alert. His strength, however, was gone, and Joey could tell it was difficult for the man to continue his performance. But this was the grand finale, the curtain call, the standing ovation.
Forget about it. Quit your looking. You don't owe it to nobody. Quit your looking and go find a cabin out there. The Rockies, something.
His head swung from side to side, fighting the urge to sleep.
They're all dead, Joe. Every fucking one of them. But you and me. Piss fucking dead. Nothing you can do about it. It's in God's hands.
He gasped a breath that came in 3 or 4 parts.
I'm in God's hands.
You've said that before. You have to come. You're going to get better.
Not this time.
His eyes focused and unfocused, and it looked like alcohol poisoning. Then he became more relaxed, tranquilized, like a dart full of sedative had struck him.
Go somewhere, Joe. All right? Anywhere. Go home, all right? Make a life.
Joey was unable to answer. Tears welled in his eyes, and he couldn't stop clearing his throat. He was going to become hysterical, and was trying not to cross that line. He remained silent, afraid to speak, terrified of opening his mouth. Rickman turned his head and saw that Joey was scared, but he didn't have time to comfort the young man. He wanted to die alone.
Go away, Christ!
He raised his voice, but with all his strength he could intimidate no one.
It isn't fake. This ain't a dream. I God to hell wish it was. It's real. There's no happy ending in this, Joe. Just got to look after yourself. Can you do that, kid?
Joey nodded.
If anyone managed to last in this world, they're dead now. Or dying like me. Don't waste it. Not with the dead. Don't you waste it, Joe.
I got it.
Joey replied, his cheeks hot and red. He covered his face and tried to hide the fact that he wasn't sobbing. Not yet. He hadn't cried when his mother abandoned him at 13. He didn't shed a tear in the face of the group home bullies or the law enforcement that followed. he never gave them the satisfaction.
You got it?
Rickman slumped a little, like a support beam had been removed from somewhere inside of him.
I got it.
Then Rickman patted Joey on the back, doing his best to show some empathy as he stared at the face of death. He had never been so blunt with the boy before. In fact, they had grown quite close in their journey. Rickman looked at Joey as the family he never abandoned, and Joey looked toward Rickman as though he were some estranged father. He'd have been the fishing sort, with all types of stories and helpful pointers on life, and cool around friends. Joey never had a whole lot of those, but Rickman wasn't really his father, so why not throw some friends in the mix? A brother? And a sister. Why not?
Go on.
That was the first night that Joey spent alone since the day the sheep went to slaughter. Such was the title awarded to November 17th, as a statutory holiday, handed down from the two last souls on earth. The date was meaningless, and perhaps even the last joke ever to be conceived by man. Dates were placed on all things, from food to war, neither of which could really be trusted. A date was even assigned many times when the world was said to reach the pinnacle of its rotation and find a terrifying and abrupt end. Yet each time, that date would come and it would pass, and humans would carry on with their boring, stupid, pointless lives saying, "Whew, boy, that was a close one." Well, not this time. This time the sheep went to slaughter. And with the most divine irony, it came while least anticipated, while no one knew what to expect. Mankind was still making grand plans for world peace and the exploration of the cosmos when it all came to a halt. This is not to say that the sickness wasn't an efficient and cold-blooded killer. It was, in fact, just that. The final estimation was 90% of the world's population eliminated within the first month of exposure. After that, Joey supposed, there was no one left to estimate things any further. Joey wasn't alone entirely, though. He did at least have the companionship of his loyal mutt, Trip, a shepherd lab mix, who was definitely man's best friend on Earth, now more than ever. Joey was not only glad to have the company, but he started to think back to times when dogs had worked side by side with people. From assisting in rescue missions to guiding the disabled, from aiding the hunters to sniffing out drugs for the pigs. And they never asked for a damn thing in return for it either. Just a bit of food here and there, the odd pat on the head, and they were happy to oblige. Maybe we had more in common with them than we knew, Joey mused. It seemed almost funny to Joey as he settled into the cargo area of the van for his night's rest, that those jobs were more prestigious and important than any he would have ever qualified for. Still, the canine was a loyal and dependable friend of man in his time on Earth, and Joey appreciated Trip even more for it. Their kinship did not go unrewarded. In the end, they were handed the cities. The land was repatriated to its intended use. All but that built 3 stories high had quickly begun returning to the natural environment, and nature was going to hold a grudge. Vines and weeds would crawl up the marble and slate. In multitudes, packs of dogs, along with many other larger animals, invaded the streets given man's absence. The rodents came first, then the larger scavengers, and then whatever predator craved the wealth of life there was now in the dead city. The animals were ravenous, as though they had been neglected and kept confined for so long and hadn't fed. Someone had unlocked the gates to a giant zoo full of rabid wildlife. Joey was restless in the van by himself, surrounded by the dead and the other nocturnal creatures of Mexico. It was an eerie feeling. Every fear he'd had as a child returned that night. He told himself, through the dusk, that morning would come, and that Trip would bark if there was a threat. But no rationalization provided relief. Now more alone than ever, he also worried about Rickman. His friend had fallen ill before, sometimes pretty bad, but he always managed to pull through. Although, with each recovery he regained a little less of his former self. But like an innocent man condemned to life in prison, Rickman persevered. Until, finally, here they were at this school in some god-forsaken developing town. The very one he'd assumed that his daughter had been attending while living with her mother and her new father. Rickman could give up the fight and leave Joey to fend for himself. Now Rick could die in peace. Joey sleeplessly pounded the last bit of topsoil into place and gave the shovel a solid stake in the earth. He fell to his knees in the newly turned ground and then to his side. His body was weak and drained. The sun was bright today. At the break of dawn, Joey and Tripp had ventured back into the gymnasium with hopes of retrieving Rickman. They had found him next to a pile of corpses where he had torn through the bodies. They were scattered about in fragments, yellow bones strung together by cartilage and bits of muscle that had not yet rotted away, all tossed about indifferently in a gruesome diameter. There, in the center of it all, Rickman was clutching only one. It was indistinguishable from the others as the flesh of each child was long gone. Only a tattered and stained dress remained, sections of which stuck to her empty frame, but mostly just hung from it like an old, dried-out dish rag on a small rack. Perhaps it was a dress that Rickman recognized, or maybe he was just grabbing at straws. Either way, Joey buried them together in the overgrown football field beside the blood-red barn. It was the first time Joey had buried anyone, and it would be his last. Driving away from the school, with Tripp now seated next to him in the passenger seat, what had until today been Rickman's spot, Joey felt as if he should be more upset. He felt guilty for not crying then, but more than grief, Joey felt envy. Rickman's troubles were all over now, and his passing spelled the beginning of a whole new set of problems for Joey to contend with. He had no one to keep him company, no one to talk with. He had no extra set of eyes to watch his back or hands to help him work. He had no knowledge but that of his own mind. It was the loss of a friend at the worst possible time.
It's just you and me now, Tripp.
Joey reached over and scratched the dog's ear, melancholy. The dog panted heavily, content and appreciated. They were just leaving the town and hitting the open highway, on the road to a new life, again, for the millionth time. It was all they had ever known and all they had ever wanted. Things always had a way of changing right when they started getting used to them. They could never get too comfortable. Something was brewing in the sky on the horizon behind them. Joey could see it clearly in his rear-view mirror, and it didn't look any kind of friendly. Mud-like clouds of black and gray, stirring in an electric puddle. These storms had gotten worse in the later years and far more unpredictable. The dangerous reality was that which had once been unpredictable had now evolved into something far more threatening. There was no rescue team to pray for should Joey become trapped. No fire department, no paramedics, and no hospitals. There was no forewarning of the events to come, be it radio or television. Not even somebody to broadcast, for that matter. And that's when it hit Joey. Very much out of nowhere, he realized that there were tears running down his cheeks. Rickman was dead. Rickman was gone. There really was no one else in the world but him. He had been listening for months on all types of devices, calling out over every frequency. All around God's green earth, no response ever came. The earth was silent and desolate, a wasteland, devoid of human life. The lightning in the disturbance was spectral at first, but Joey could feel the reverberation of the thunder throughout his van. It was carried along the ground for miles away and came up through Joey's tires, vibrating under his foot at the pedal and in his seat. It was like the noise had not at all come from the sky, but from the growling stomach of the earth, far below her surface, far below her mantle, from the very deepest places where no light had ever been. It was hungry for Joey and would swallow him whole. If this was moving toward him, Joey would need to find a place to sit it out, and he would do well to find it quickly. Taking chances in a storm like this was, at a time long ago, an activity reserved only for the thrill-seekers, the scientists, and the suicidally insane. Those who knew what was good for them stayed inside. They stayed locked in their basements or in their shelters, cowering next to a support beam and praying to whatever God gave them courage that they should survive the rage. But no matter where you sought refuge, survival was never more than a gamble, especially in this part of the world near the equator, where the storms knew no boundary and every record was only set to be broken.